It is a good evening, isn't it? I did it again. What do you say? I hope it's a good evening. And if it's not, I'm not going to say by the time the sermon's over. Maybe that'll be different. I'm not even going to go there. But maybe by the time everything is said and done this evening, maybe we'll be a little more encouraged by having been together and sing and pray together. And yes, hear somebody stand up and present God's word, regardless of who that is or isn't. But I am thankful to be the guy tonight who has that opportunity. It's good to be back with you all this evening. Hope you had a good morning and afternoon. I at least had a good morning with many of you. Hope you, or I expect you did as well. Let's consider this evening that rather strong question. Do you know? Can you know? It's when you begin to share your faith with someone, or in some way it comes up in conversation that you're someone who believes and at least tries to follow Jesus. And then but can you know? Or as it is there, it's not on the screen. Okay, there it is. All right. As it is there and hopefully on the handout, it might even be, well, can you know? Can you really know, though? Isn't that just something that is your personal belief? You feel that way? And sometimes there's some ammunition given within the world of Christendom where people will say, I can't really know or have confidence in things about Jesus and his death, his resurrection for sure, but I feel it to be true. I believe it. I have faith that it's true. Then we hear phrases like a blind leap in the dark or even a blind faith. Is it possible to know what you believe about Jesus? And it's one of those sermons where I'm hesitant to go ahead and answer the question, but just in case something happens between now and the end of the sermon, I'm going to go ahead and say yes. I'm convinced that it's possible to be fully convicted and to be able to sincerely say, I know that Jesus rose from the dead. It's not something I simply feel. I have some feelings about it. It's not something I simply think happened or hope happens. I can know it happens. Now, a few more observations. Foundation matters. You can look at that in two ways. One is that your foundation, it matters, but also let's think about some foundational matters this evening. If I approach the Scriptures, if I approach the message about Jesus from a foundation that is naturalistic, that starts from the basis of there is no supernatural, there are no miracles, what we have in what sometimes is called the empirical realm, this physical material world, it's a closed system. You have what you have. You got matter and space and time. Nothing intervenes and ever has intervened into that. If that is my foundation, I'm not saying anyone here tonight has that foundation. That's not the point. You never know. Can't assume either way, right? But if that is, then I don't know that there's any evidence, any argument that will be satisfactory. It's always going to come up short. If that's my presumption or assumption even that everything is natural, nothing supernatural, then I don't know that the evidence will change anything. I have to at least be open to the potential of something beyond the natural world as I come to the evidence. Now let's flip the switch a bit. It's also the case that simply wanting something to be true doesn't determine truth. Is it true that I want to believe, I want it to be true that Jesus rose again? Absolutely. But I have to, if I'm going to really survey the evidence, and maybe even do this periodically throughout my life as a Christian, I have to sit down and say, okay, I got to try as much as I can to put that aside. Like someone says, the Bible isn't true because it works for you. The reason it works in your life is what? Because it is true. You've got to determine, is it true or not? Is it historical or not? Before you go on to, is it a good thing or not? Do I consider this good news or not? Is it true news? Might be the first question, right? Is there some narrative out here that is not quite true? Is it grounded in reality? Foundation matters. Where I start matters on both sides, then. If I start and say, nothing supernatural, don't be surprised if that's where I stay. If I start with I just want to find what sounds good and what's believable to me, well, then I'm not going to determine truth either. Now, one more thought before we look at these three together. I believe it was Carl Sagan who had made the quote that's become somewhat famous now, and you'll see it a lot in apologetic discussions. He said that extraordinary claims, like the Bible and the resurrection, require extraordinary support or evidence. Now, I'm not even saying that's wrong, but it's one of those statements that we must then ask of it, what do you mean by that? Is what we're about to survey this evening, someone could easily say that it is pretty incredible evidence, pretty unique or extraordinary. But it's important to keep in mind that if my foundation is off, then I get to set the terms, right? I get to decide, well, that's not extraordinary to me, or that's not enough for me. If that's where I am, then nothing will ever be enough evidence to convince me. I say all that not to preach to the Sunday night crowd, as much to remind us of where many people come from in our culture today when it comes to something like the resurrection. Let's survey the evidence then together. I say survey mainly because we're not going to get into all the gritty details tonight. That's not the purpose of tonight. It's more to add up all the evidence. And the way I have it imaged there is not necessarily to say that these three, one leads to the other or one builds on the other. But what I had in mind was this, just to make it clear, that these do build and connect. Not necessarily one on top of the other as much as you put them all together. It's one thing to talk about the empty tomb, and that's powerful. But the empty tomb alone, it's just the empty tomb. And it might be convincing, but it's not near as convincing as when you put it with the rest of the evidence. That's why we look at these three tonight: the tomb, the witnesses, and the extreme. And then I have for you a few other words, and if you've got the handout, there's a place there. We'll fill those in as we go along. Let's look at the tomb together. Can you know? Yes, one of the reasons I can know that the Lord is a risen Lord is because of the tomb. The tomb, and here's the additional word, the tomb was found empty. Empty. That's the evidence. Now what you do with the empty tomb, that's the second step. The tomb was found empty. Let's open up together to Luke chapter 24. 24th chapter of Luke is one of the places where the discovery of this empty tomb is documented. Along the lines of what we were saying a moment ago about our foundation, it's rather fascinating that virtually all historians and ancient scholars, or scholars of the ancient world, would agree that everything in the four gospel accounts, including this one, Luke, virtually all scholars would agree that everything in, let's say, Luke, is historically sound. If you take out all the miracles and supernatural occurrences. But they'll say everything else is historical. So then why reject the rest, the miraculous side? Something else to contemplate on as we read Luke 24. He writes, "But on the first day of the week, at early dawn, they went to the tomb." To the women that had been a part of the burial back in chapter 23. Taking the spices they had prepared. And they found the stone rolled away from the tomb. But when they went in, they did not find the body of the Lord Jesus. While they were perplexed about this, behold, two men stood by them in dazzling apparel. And as they were frightened and bowed their faces to the ground, the men said to them, "Why do you seek the living among the dead? He is not here, but he has risen. Remember how he told you while he was still in Galilee that the Son of Man must be delivered into the hands of sinful men and be crucified and on the third day rise? And they remembered his words, and returning from the tomb, they told all these things to the 11 and to the rest. Now it was Mary Magdalene and Joanna and Mary, the mother of James, and the other women with them, who told these things to the apostles. But these words, the end of verse 11 says, they seemed to them an idle tale, and they did not believe them. Even with the 11 at this point apostles, when they heard about the empty tomb, they didn't know for sure yet what to do with it. They didn't believe yet. It's starting points to even hear in that time the tomb is empty, the Lord is missing. Now, we can try and explain it away. Some have said over the centuries, well, he wasn't really dead. He just passed out very deeply, went into a deep coma, and they thought he was dead, and they put him in the tomb, and then the cool air of the tomb, and a couple of days or so pass, and then he gets up, he rolls the heavy stone away by himself in his condition. I don't know what he does to the two guards, but it leaves them like dead men. And then he walks miles that same time. And he does a whole lot of other things. It has a lot of adventures, we'd say, as somebody who was left in a deep coma by scourging and crucifixion. If you want to look this up, it's called the swoon theory. He just swooned. What does that word? Others have suggested they went to the wrong tomb. You back up and you read the detailed accounts of the burial, and that becomes very unlikely. And then all the enemies of the cross of Christ, the enemies of Jesus, had to do at that point was point out the mistake, right? And Christianity would have been long forgotten as a brief rise and fall on the pages of religious history. What happened? We might phrase it this way: who moved the body? It's gone. Who moved the body? The body's still around. A month and a half later, borrowing from this morning's sermon, when Pentecost shows up, Peter preaches his sermon. Let's say, going against our if this morning, let's say it didn't happen and Peter still preaches the sermon. And the body had just been moved. Once more, all the enemies have to do is present, here's the body. Some would suggest as well that they didn't bury crucified criminals. They just threw them in a mass grave or in a ditch somewhere. Now again, the historical documents would contradict that quite strongly, but supposing, we get to do a lot of supposing tonight, what happens when Peter stands up and says, the tomb's empty because God raised him up? Just like David predicted, what happens? Who moved the body? And then what happened to the body if he was still dead? Here's what you're left with. It was either the work of humanity or human work or divine work. Bottom line, with the tomb that's empty. If his friends just moved the body, and that was the lie that the soldiers were bribed to say, his disciples stole the body while we were sleeping. Again, how that even happened, if you just take apart the details of that story. But if that happened, one, they don't have the power or the authority to do that. They're the Galilean, most of them Galilean fishermen and a tax collector and that sort, and who have ran for their lives and denied him openly. At least one of them. The others have all fled. So they don't even have the motive at this point to do that. And then if you look at, well, what if the others somehow, for some reason, stole the body, just out of spite or something? Well, not only does the motive get very fishy from the outset, then it makes it that much easier for them to say, we stole the body. And if you try to get into some kind of conspiracy where that happened and it was somehow covered up, well, then you get pretty deep into a conspiracy that is far more speculation than anything else. The tomb is a part of the evidence. The tomb was found empty. You have to answer the question, what happened to the tomb? Why was it empty? human work or divine work. Divine work, explanation says, Jesus rose from the dead, an angel rolled the stone away, he walks out the tomb. Let's consider, on the second place this evening, the witnesses. The witnesses. The witnesses are eyewitnesses. They have that first-hand credibility. And so I put down there the word credible. And you can add these up. The tomb, empty. The witnesses found to be credible. They're credible witnesses. One thing for someone to say, this is what I saw. Something else for someone to stand up who is a credible, trustworthy witness and say, this is what I saw. And once more, they've suggested different ways to brush away or explain away the eyewitnesses. They just saw hallucinations. And then you start counting how many times. There's over 15 specific appearances listed throughout the documents. You start counting how many different people were involved. It'd be one thing if it was the same one or two people over and over again, maybe. And then the different locations. And the psychology begins to quickly break down. Or they just saw a ghost. They were just seeing ghosts. And whether that means you believe it was a real ghost or they were seeing some type of figment, something like that. Here's one quick question. Who made the breakfast that they ate in John 21? Who ate the breakfast with them? Now, I'll grant, Jesus did some pretty amazing things post-resurrection. He passes through locked doors and things, and I suggest that gives more insight into the spiritual body and things, but there's these other questions you got to raise. Well, who walked with the two men into Jerusalem? And then you start looking at all these different appearances. Luke, later in his second volume, Acts chapter 1, 1 through 3, gives a bit of I'd call it a summary or a review of how Jesus was with them those 40 days, he calls them proofs, attestable facts, showing himself to be alive. It is not that Jesus supposedly rose from the dead on that Sunday, he makes a few appearances, a few people see him, and then he's gone. By Monday, there's no more. Or even a week later. If you want to play with explanations and trying to figure it out, okay. But over 40 days? How does that add up? Credibility. It's an ancient thing, it's a modern thing. That some of the highest, would say the highest form of evidence and testimony that would even convict somebody in a courtroom. It's not circumstantial evidence. We could put the empty tomb in that category if we wanted to. It is eyewitness testimony. Let's read from 1 Corinthians 15 now. 1 Corinthians 15, 1 through 11. Same verses, ironically, as Luke 24. Here's the list. It might be the best if you're just looking for one passage to read about different appearances. It doesn't list all of them, but it lists a good portion of them. The list in 1 Corinthians 15. We begin with a more familiar section in the first 3 verses. 4 through 11 add this historical side. He says, now I would remind you, brothers, of the gospel that I preached to you, which you received, in which you stand, and by which you are being saved. If you hold fast to the word I preached to you, unless you believed in vain. For I delivered to you as of first importance what I also received. Christ died for our sins in accordance with the Scriptures, that he was buried, and that he was raised on the third day in accordance with the Scriptures. And that he appeared to Cephas. We usually know him as what? Peter. Simon Peter. Aramaic Cephas. Or Aramaic. Then to the 12. Then he appeared to more than 500 brothers at one time, most of whom are still alive, though some have fallen asleep. Why does he say most of them are still alive? when he writes this? If people in Corinth had the mind to, if they weren't convinced, they could find some of these people. At best, they could write some letters, get some names and write some letters. Now, we don't know that that ever happened from Corinth. Don't know that they needed that. But it's as if Paul's saying, just in case you need some more verification, many of them are still alive. Now, I had to pick a bone with Terrence because he preached part of this Wednesday evening. And I already planned to preach this. I didn't change it, obviously. But I did like the one thing he said, that there's at least 251. You get that? 251 plus witnesses are still left alive, because Paul says 500, and then there's most of the 500, or more than half of the 500 are still alive. Think about that. How would that work? I mean, there's been some mass events and some people that were convinced of things, but this is all the different angles. You've got one person, a couple of people, 12 people, 500 people, different times, different places, over a month plus span. And then he says this. Then he appeared to James, then to all the apostles. Last of all, as to one untimely born, he appeared also to me. For I am the least of the apostles, unworthy to be called an apostle, because I persecuted the church of God. But by the grace of God, I am what I am, and his grace toward me was not in vain. On the contrary, I worked harder than any of them, though it was not I, but the grace of God that is with me. Whether then it was I or they, so we preached, and so you believed. Eyewitness testimony. What do you do with the eyewitnesses' evidence? Now, I'm going to try this. I don't know how well this is going to work in this setting, but we're going to try it, okay? Credibility. Credibility. I got to find the right pocket, or it's not going to work at all. I've got a quarter, just a regular quarter, nothing special, in the palm of my hand. Raise your hand if you believe I have a quarter in my hand. You don't all have to raise your hands, okay? You know, that's not the point of the sermon. Okay, I was hoping for one, so I got a few more than one. All right, we still got a few skeptics, and that's good. Raise your hand if you would say it's possible to know something for sure you've never seen with your own eyes. How many of you think that? And you can play this a lot of different ways. And I don't mean it's a game, but it's a way of thinking about it. You can ask about historical characters that are long dead. You can ask about countries you've never visited. You might today with our technology, you say, well, I've seen pictures and video, but then again, sometimes that's worse, right? Like, what if we had a video of Jesus walking out of the tomb? Well, what do people say the first thing? Well, that was doctored, right? So, yeah. Let's try this, all right? I'm not leaving. I'm just going to the back, all right? And then this is not one of those, I'm not going to go up and down the pews, and Jeff's like, wait, he's coming to me, isn't he? Okay, I'm going to show the two guys in the booth, 2 or 3 witnesses, right? Convinced? Okay. Do I have a quarter in my hand? They're nodding. Okay, we got a yes. Okay, all right. They can't see you all. Not all of them are looking back to see if you nod, but okay. Now, what do you think? See, now it's not just me. Now I'm putting them on the spot, right? How much do you trust Jeff and Gary? Do you think I have a quarter in my hand? I'm not doing a big reveal. Sorry. Now that's a very simple, trivial thing. Okay, and I'm not saying that's on the same level at all. I'm saying the resurrection of Jesus, from the empty tomb to the eyewitnesses, and the way that their testimony is recorded in historically reliable documents and has changed the course of history. I'm saying that's on a whole other level. It's in a different category than holding a quarter and convincing you by 2 or 3 witnesses. I could do other things, indirect evidence, right? I could take the quarter and do that and scrape it on the side of pew, right? Indirect evidence. Still haven't, maybe a couple of you might have caught it, right? Credibility. Someone says, I saw something, and they're trustworthy. But what if they lie? What if they lie? Let's get to that momentarily. But for now, when we talk about the resurrection, can you know? There's the empty tomb. What do you do with that? Then there are the eyewitnesses who provide the explanation for the empty tomb. Now we have one more, and that's the extreme. The extreme. Now, if you're someone who likes alliteration, you can make all of these alliterated very easily, right? You have the empty tomb, the eyewitnesses, and the extreme. But the other two words here, I did keep those alliterated for this outline, are transformation and testing. Transformation and testing. We alluded to some of this morning, more with the crowd, but what did happen? How do you go from disappointed, broken disciples, let's say by Saturday, and then some of them still not sure what to think on part of Sunday, and then they preach and teach and live their lives completely differently than they would have otherwise? They continue rather to give up their careers and their families and their homes, and they travel the world telling people about the risen Lord. How do you explain that? If you say it was all a conspiracy, they lied about it, changed lives. Then someone says, well, people have done some pretty crazy things, and they were deceived, and the ringleaders maybe knew better, but they still did some pretty crazy things. Changed lives and more. Let's turn to Acts chapter 8. We're in 1 Corinthians 15. You're still there. Go back with me to Acts. Look at Acts 8. How many of them are willing to suffer? That's why I put transformation and testing. This idea, this proclamation was put to the test so many times. Now, when you get to Acts 8, you've just read about Stephen, who is stoned for his proclamation, his unwillingness to give it up, even at the threat of death. And it's not like they caught Stephen off guard, and before he knew it, they were throwing stones. He had plenty of opportunity to relent. But he doesn't. He just says, Father, forgive them, and into your hands. And then we read this. Acts chapter 8. And Saul approved of his execution. And there arose on that day a great persecution against the church in Jerusalem, and they were all scattered throughout the regions of Judea and Samaria, except the apostles. Devout men buried Stephen and made great lamentation over him. So they are scattered. They do express their grief. But the one thing they don't do, at least as a whole, is stop. Look at what happens. It says Saul was ravaging the church, verse 3, and entering house after house, he dragged off men and women and committed them to prison. And while that's happening, verse 4, now those who were scattered went about. So you're running from Jerusalem because you're being persecuted because you believe and teach Jesus as resurrected Jesus. Jewish leaders didn't mind you talking about Jesus that much. It was that resurrection part they really hated anyway. That was the sticking point for them of all things. Why? And then you're running away. I'm not using that in a bad sense necessarily. You're leaving because of the persecution. You'd keep it as your personal belief, right? In the private of your home, and wouldn't dare tell anybody that you believe in Jesus. That's the whole reason you had to leave Jerusalem. But they do. Additionally, by and large, as we say, it is the ringleaders who suffer along with them, sometimes more so. It's Paul who has to leave in his missionary journeys because he's the one becomes the focal target. It is all but one of the apostles, and we've made almost a saying out of this, right? They all die as martyrs. And if anybody's going to know that it didn't happen, it'd be the apostles. I think about, and some of you may not even know about this. I'm not technically old enough to know about it, but I do. Drinking the Kool-Aid, anybody know what that means? I remember years ago, there was a discussion in a kind of across the room, and somebody overheard somebody talking. I'm not a Kool-Aid drinker, and this other person, just overhearing, eavesdropping, says, I never liked Kool-Aid anyway myself. But if you look at if you know the story of Jim Jones and his cult, and they all drank the Kool-Aid except whom? I mean, a few others didn't as well. They were smart enough, I guess. But who's the one guy that definitely did not drink the Kool-Aid? Jim Jones. Now, he's found dead later with a bullet in the head, and they don't know how that happened for sure still. Was it suicide or murder or what? But he didn't drink the Kool-Aid for a reason. Because it's one thing to live a lie. People do that. Some people do that every day. It's something else to die for it. The extreme transformation and testing. And then you take the guy who is chasing them out of Jerusalem, the ringleader of the opposing side. He's the guy who wrote 1 Corinthians 15. Let's read some more of his words before we close this evening. Also in Acts 20. We'll pick up in verse 22. As Paul gathers the Ephesian elders to him for this final meeting. They travel miles to catch up to Paul as he's on his way to Jerusalem. Here's part of what he tells them in Acts 20, verse 22. And now, behold, I am going to Jerusalem, constrained by the Spirit, not knowing what will happen to me there, except the Holy Spirit testifies to me in every city that imprisonment and afflictions await me. But I do not account my life of any value, nor as precious to myself, if only I may finish my course and the ministry that I have received from the Lord Jesus. What is it? To testify to the gospel of the grace of God. And now, behold, I know that none of you among whom I have gone about proclaiming the kingdom will see my face again. You do not write the way the Apostle Paul writes if you're insane or a little touched, as they say. You do not write or say words like that if you're living and then about, and you know it about, as he says, to die for what you know is a lie. When Paul has the pivotal turn on the road to Damascus, he has no status or stuff to gain. I like to use the other big three: possessions, power, and pleasure. That's how sin gets at us. You could use those for Paul, and so instead of just repeating those tonight, I thought of two other ways of putting it, and it's brief, or briefer, shorter. However, I can't talk tonight, obviously. But he didn't have any status to gain. Not in his time, for sure. You trade being the one who's leading the persecution and getting letters to do so from the high priest, and they're sending you on missions. You trade that to become the 13th least of the apostles? There's no money or possessions or power or position to be gained. Now, a couple of thousand years later, we think of him as the great apostle Paul. And other than Jesus, you'd come close to find somebody who has had more written about and of his writings than any other character in history. But he didn't know that. He would die by Caesar's hand. All because he saw the Lord, risen Lord. There's something powerful about that kind of hope. That's why they would give their lives, they would give whatever it takes for that truth. It's been said the only thing more powerful than fear is hope. Can you know? Do you see him? He sits there. You might have a scribe sitting there. You might have a Roman soldier standing by. And it might be historically the second or third time around. And he might say something like, I know the end is nearing. And you say, well, Paul, can you know? No, you don't have to ask that question for the Apostle Paul. Can you know? Now, Rod's going to lead us in an invitation song this evening. Can we also borrow from this morning and say, and I put it on the handout as maybe, and that's meant to be a little sarcastic there. Just maybe, in view of the evidence, maybe I should answer the call when he says, follow me. Maybe it's worth it, after all. And the resurrection, bodily resurrection, was not a new idea in Second Temple Judaism, not a new idea. Unless you're a Sadducee, and you know what they say about the Sadducees, you're Sadducee, but unless you're a Sadducee, first century Jews, the idea of a bodily resurrection in general is not new. Some have tried to say, well, they just made it up. The apostles made up the whole idea. Not true. But what was truly new about this message of resurrection was that Jesus was resurrected bodily to never, ever die again. And then that gives the promise, the hope for us of our own life to never die again. You see, it is something worth believing. Let's just make sure it's true first. We sometimes sing these words, but I'm just going to say them. And the lesson, the sermon will be yours. There, in the ground his body lay, light of the world by darkness slain. And yet, bursting forth in glorious day, he rose again. And as he stands in victory, sin's curse has lost its grip on me. For I am his, and he is mine, bought with the precious blood of Christ. Now let's stand together and sing.